There is a moment, and I want you to understand this before anything else. There is a moment in every training cycle at the Veloran Military Integration Academy when the new cadets decide what kind of soldiers they are going to be. Not in combat, not in a simulator, not in some dramatic live-fire exercise where everyone already knows the stakes. It happens quietly, in a corridor, in a cafeteria, in a place where nobody important is watching, or so they think. It happened in Hall 7 of the Western Dormitory Block on the 43rd day of the first unification intake, year 3 of the Combined Species Accords. And the thing that made it matter, the thing that turned it from a small, ugly moment into something that got filed in 4 different command archives and discussed at 2 separate officers' training conferences, wasn't what the cadets did. It was what happened 9 seconds later. I know because I was standing at the far end of that corridor. I had a cup of protein broth in my hand that I hadn't touched because it smelled like something had died in it twice, and I was watching. I watched the whole thing. My name is Cadet 3rd Class Priya Menon, and I am submitting this account because Commander Yale Das personally requested that every witness submit an individual record. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly here because I wrote it down the moment she said it, I want their words, not a summary. Their words, because in 30 years this is the kind of thing that gets forgotten, and it shouldn't be. So here it is. Here are my words. Segment 2, Setup. Let me tell you about the Veloran Military Integration Academy first, because if you don't know what it is, none of the rest of this makes sense. It's not on Earth. It's not on any planet technically. It exists on a deep space platform called the Convergence Node, which orbits a dim amber star about 40 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. The platform is roughly the size of a small moon, not a real moon, but the kind humans used to describe things by saying, the size of a small moon. And it has been operating as a joint military training facility for 11 years now. Since the Third Kalori War ended, and somebody very smart in the Combined Species Assembly figured out that the only way to stop 7 different spacefaring civilizations from constantly trying to kill each other was to make them train together when they were young and impressionable. I say very smart. I actually think it was several committees working over several years and that nobody had a single brilliant idea, but that's bureaucracy. The point is the Academy exists, and it takes cadets from 8 different species: humans, Kalori, Vrenathi, Gajik, Preth, Solon, Torathi, and the unnamed ones, who have a name but it takes 17 seconds to pronounce, and they've given us a shorter one for daily use. And it trains them together for 2 years. 2 years of shared dormitories, shared mess halls, shared simulators, shared physical training, shared academic blocks, and enough cultural misunderstanding to fill a very long, very depressing book. The building itself is a masterpiece of engineering and a nightmare of daily life. It was designed to accommodate 8 different atmospheric pressure preferences, 4 different gravitational tolerances, 2 species that breathe nitrogen-heavy mixtures, and 1 species, the Solon, who require ambient humidity so high that they essentially walk around in a light drizzle. The corridors are wide enough that a Gajik, who are roughly the size and shape of a large Earth rhinoceros, can pass a Preth, who stand about 3 meters tall and have 6 limbs, without anyone getting hurt. The lighting is a compromise. It's always a compromise. Too bright for Vrenathi eyes, too dim for Gajik night vision suppression protocols. Somewhere in the middle where everyone is slightly uncomfortable, which is, someone once told me, the physical metaphor for the entire Combined Species Accord. I arrived at the Academy in what the human calendar called March, though March means nothing out here where the star is amber and there are no seasons. I was assigned to Intake Group 7, which had 14 cadets total, 3 humans, 4 Kalori, 2 Vrenathi, 2 Gajik, 1 Preth, and 1 Solon who went by the name Vessels of Still Water but told us to call her Still, which we did. The three humans were me, a cadet from the Andean district of South America named Tomás Viracocha, and a cadet from what used to be called the Horn of Africa named Elias Bikel. Elias Bikel. That's the name you need to remember. Segment 3, The World Before the Moment. The Academy was 43 days into the first intake cycle when what I'm describing happened, which means we were past the initial adjustment period. The first 2 weeks where everyone is too overwhelmed and exhausted to be hostile, and into the phase that the senior instructors called the sorting. The sorting is not an official phase. It's not in any syllabus, but every instructor I've spoken to acknowledges it exists, and the psychological research team embedded at the Academy has written 3 papers about it. It's the phase where cadets figure out the social hierarchy, where they figure out who is strong and who is weak, who to respect and who to dismiss, who will be an ally and who will be irrelevant. It happens in every military training environment in the galaxy, apparently. The shape of it changes, different species use different signals and different social cues, but the instinct is the same. Size up your cohort, find your place in it. The Kalori in particular are very good at this. Kalori are, and I want to be precise here because I don't want this to read like a species-wide condemnation, a species with a deeply embedded hierarchy culture. Their home civilization is organized around what translates roughly as earned standing, and from birth they are socialized to assess everyone around them in terms of relative standing. Who is superior? Who is subordinate? What behaviors demonstrate which category? The 4 Kalori in Intake Group 7 were named Vethok, Skaran, Milas, and Dran. They were young, equivalent to early 20s in human terms, and they were, by their own species standards, high status. They came from established families. They had done well in preliminary assessments. They were tall, even for Kalori, with the characteristic pale gray scaled skin and the deep-set amber eyes and the rigid posture that Kalori consider a sign of confidence and humans tend to find vaguely intimidating. They were also, as I came to understand over those 43 days, deeply uncertain. They were far from home, in a facility that didn't operate by their rules, surrounded by species they didn't know how to read, and they were compensating for that uncertainty the way most people compensate for uncertainty, by asserting themselves wherever they could find a foothold. By the 43rd day, they had found one. The foothold was Elias Bikel. Segment 4, Elias. I need to tell you about Elias properly, because the story doesn't work without understanding who he was. Elias Bikel was 26 years old. He had come from a military family. His mother had served in the East African Federal Defense Force, his grandfather before her, and he had spent 4 years in the Ethiopian ground forces before applying to the Integration Academy. He had combat experience. Real combat experience, not simulator hours. 2 years of counterinsurgency operations in a mountainous region I'm not authorized to name specifically, followed by 18 months on peacekeeping deployment in a dispute zone near the Red Sea. He had been recommended for the Integration Academy by 3 separate commanding officers, which is unusual. Typically, 1 recommendation is sufficient. 3 means someone went out of their way to say something. He was, by any objective military metric, one of the most qualified candidates in our intake. None of the Kalori knew any of that. What they knew, what they could observe, was this: Elias was quiet, remarkably quiet, not shy, not timid, not socially avoidant, just quiet in the specific way that some people with genuine depth are quiet. He spoke when he had something to say. He didn't speak when he didn't. He didn't fill silence with noise. He didn't perform confidence or camaraderie. He would sit in the cafeteria and eat his meal slowly, methodically, watching the room with an expression that gave away nothing. He would sit in lectures and take notes by hand, actual paper and a pen, an affectation that several cadets found amusing, with his head down and his focus absolute. He would walk the corridors of the dormitory block at the end of the day with his hands behind his back and his pace unhurried, and he would nod to people he passed, but he would not stop unless stopped. To Kalori eyes, where status is demonstrated through vocal assertion, through claiming space, through actively inserting yourself into social situations, this read as submission, as weakness, as a cadet who had already found his place at the bottom of the hierarchy and accepted it. Vethok, in particular, had decided Elias was a non-entity. I watched it happen over 2 weeks. Small things. The way Vethok would speak across Elias in group discussions, as though he wasn't there. The way he would place his tray at the cafeteria table without acknowledging Elias' presence, even when Elias was sitting directly across from him. Once, in a corridor briefing, Vethok had pointed to each cadet in sequence as he made a tactical suggestion, and when he got to Elias, he had simply moved his pointing arm to the next cadet without stopping. Not cruel, just absent. Elias noticed. I know he noticed because I watched his eyes track the movement of Vethok's arm, and I watched his expression stay entirely still in the way that a person's expression stays still when they have decided a long time ago not to give that kind of thing any of their energy. But on day 43, Vethok decided absent wasn't enough. Segment 5, Hall 7, 6:18 hours. It started in the morning. Not in the cafeteria, not in a classroom. In the corridor, Hall 7, Western Dormitory Block, at 6:18 in the morning, which is early even by Academy standards. I know the time because the wall panels in Hall 7 display chronometric information in 3 different species time formats, and when I think back to that morning, I can still see the amber digits of the human standard clock in my peripheral vision. 6:18. The station's light cycle was still in its pre-dawn simulation, which means the corridor lighting was at 40%, dim enough to feel like early morning, bright enough to see clearly. I was heading to the equipment bay because I had a fitting at 0630 for a recalibrated pressure suit, and the equipment bay was at the other end of Hall 7, and I was walking quickly because I'd overslept by 11 minutes. Elias was in the corridor before me. He was doing what he sometimes did in the early mornings, walking. Just walking at that unhurried pace of his, hands behind his back, in the direction of the observation deck at the western end of the station. The observation deck has a view of the amber star and the scatter of deep space beyond it, and Elias had told me once, one of the few personal things he'd volunteered, that he found it calming to watch the star before the day began. He was almost at the junction where Hall 7 meets the outer corridor when the Kalori cadets came around the corner. All 4 of them. Vethok, Skaran, Milas, and Drawn. They were in training kit. They'd clearly come from the early morning physical block, which runs from 5:30 to 6:15, and they were in the middle of a conversation in Kalori, which I don't speak well enough to follow but sounds like someone slowly tearing thick paper. They were moving fast, the way Kalori move when they're feeling strong after exercise, which is to say they were taking up most of the corridor. Elias stopped. He stopped and stepped to the side, not all the way to the wall, just enough to cede the center of the corridor, and he waited for them to pass. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his hands behind his back and waited. Vethok saw him. Vethok stopped too, and he said something in Kalori, something short, 3 or 4 syllables, and Skaran laughed and Drawn laughed, and Milas didn't laugh but made a sound that I can only describe as dismissive. I know that sound. Humans make a version of it too. It's the sound you make when someone below your notice has briefly become visible, and then you dismiss them back into invisibility. Then Vethok said something else. This part I half understood, because he used the galactic standard suffix that Kalori attach when they're addressing someone they consider subordinate. A suffix that has no perfect human translation but means something between lower standing and negligible. He was telling Elias to move. Elias was already moved. He was standing aside. There was plenty of room. But that wasn't really the point. Segment 6, The Mockery. The point was the performance. I understand this now better than I did then. The Kalori cadets didn't need Elias to move. They had room to pass. What they needed, what Vethok needed, specifically, was to perform the social act of making a subordinate acknowledge that they were subordinate. Vethok said something longer this time. I caught about a third of it. Enough to understand that he was commenting on the way Elias was standing, hands behind his back, watching them with that absolutely still expression, and not in a complimentary way. Then Scarin said something, and Drawn, and they were all looking at Elias now, and they were doing that thing that young soldiers in groups do when they think the audience is only themselves, performing for each other, escalating because escalation is the social currency of the moment, adding to the mockery because not adding to it means you're not fully part of the group. Here is what I understood, in fragments, with the benefit of later translation assistance. Vethok said something about silence being the armor of those who have nothing worth saying. Scarin said something about the human's soft skin, and how it explained why they preferred to stand in corners. Drawn, who was the youngest and the least composed of the four, said something that I will not repeat in full here, but that referenced Elias' stillness in a way that was meant to imply cowardice. And then Vethok, and this is the part I remember most clearly, the part that I wrote down verbatim as soon as I got back to my quarters that evening. Vethok looked at Elias directly, amber eyes level and flat, and he said in galactic standard, switching languages so there would be no misunderstanding. We've heard humans used to fight each other for centuries with small sticks and sharp rocks. Tell me, is that why you carry nothing? Or is it because you've learned there's no point? He smiled when he said it. The Kalori smile is different from a human smile, wider, with the secondary jaw slightly extended, but the meaning was the same. The meaning was, I am above you, confirm it. I was standing at the far end of Hall 7. My protein broth was cold. I watched Elias. Segment 7, the silence. Elias did not move. He did not react in any of the ways that the Kalori cadets were clearly anticipating. He did not get angry, no raised voice, no flushed face, none of the physical markers of human emotional reaction that Vethok had probably read about in an orientation file. He did not back down further, did not shrink against the wall or drop his gaze, or make any of the submissive gestures that Kalori culture reads as an acknowledgement of lower standing. He stood exactly as he had been standing. Hands behind his back. Weight evenly distributed. Expression completely still. He looked at Vethok. Not looked through him, not looked past him. Looked at him. The way a person looks at something they are assessing with complete, unhurried precision. The silence lasted approximately 9 seconds. I counted, not at the time but afterward, reconstructing the memory. Because in those 9 seconds, before anything else happened, before anyone else appeared, before the moment turned into what it turned into in those 9 seconds, something changed in that corridor. I felt it, though I couldn't name it then. Later I would come to understand it as the feeling of being in the presence of someone who is genuinely unbothered, not performing calm, not suppressing reaction, actually, structurally, at the cellular level, unbothered. Elias had stood in corridors like this before, not in space stations, not with Kalori cadets, but in the particular structural experience that this moment was someone who believes themselves superior asking you to confirm it. Elias had stood in that corridor many times, in mountains with rifles, in peacekeeping zones where the right response to provocation was no response, in the specific, exhausting, precise discipline of choosing not to give your energy to something that doesn't deserve it. He looked at Vethok for 9 seconds. Then he said quietly, in galactic standard, "Sticks and rocks won every war we needed to win." That was all. He turned and continued walking toward the observation deck. And that was the moment that exact moment, with his back to them and his pace unchanged, when the door at the far end of Hall 7 opened. Segment 8, The Commander. I need to pause here and tell you about Commander Yale Das, because otherwise you won't understand what happened next. Commander Yale Das was the senior commanding officer of the Veloran Military Integration Academy's first intake cohort. She held the rank of Quad Commander, which is the integration command equivalent of roughly a brigadier general in old Earth military terms, high enough to have real authority, experienced enough that the authority had been tested many times. She was 54 years old. She was originally from a small coastal city in what was once Israel, though she had spent the last 18 years in space and considered the Convergence node more home than anywhere planetary. She was known, and this is documented in her service file, not just Academy gossip, for 3 things. First, she was the most decorated human officer serving in the Integration Command, with commendations from 3 different species military authorities, which is extremely unusual. Second, she had served, before her appointment to the Academy, as a battlefield commander in the Second Kalori conflict, where she had led a joint human-Vranathi defensive operation that had held a critical supply corridor for 11 days against sustained assault, and which had directly contributed to the ceasefire that ended that war. Third, she did not, under any circumstances, salute cadets. This was not a rule, it was not policy. It was simply a thing that Commander Yale Das did not do. She acknowledged cadets, she addressed them. She corrected them and commended them, and when warranted, demolished them verbally in a way that several senior instructors described as a privilege to witness. But she did not salute cadets. A salute, in combined species military tradition, is a recognition of earned standing, and cadets, by definition, had not yet earned it. In 11 years of command at the Academy, she had saluted 1 cadet. 1. And that happened in Hall 7, on day 43 at 6:21 in the morning. Segment 9, What I Saw. The door at the far end of Hall 7 opened, and Commander Das walked through it. She was in her duty uniform, dark gray-blue, the Integration Command color, with the 4 stars of her rank at her collar and the combat decorations along her left breast panel, which she wore on duty because the Academy's regulations required that ranking officers display their combat record in shared spaces. It's a combined species accord tradition, originally Kalori, adopted because it allows cadets of all species to read a commander's history without needing a separate briefing. I recognized her immediately. Every cadet in Group 7 recognized her immediately. She conducted our weekly cohort review sessions and had addressed us on the first day of intake with a speech I still have memorized, not because I studied it, but because it was the kind of speech that lodges itself in you. She was walking at a measured pace, not rushing, not slow. The pace of someone who has been walking with authority for a long time and doesn't need to perform it. She entered Hall 7 at the far end, which meant she was walking toward the group, toward Vethok and Skaran and Milas and Dran, who were still standing where Elias had left them, and toward Elias, who was walking away from them, toward the observation deck, and toward Commander Das's position. I watched her face. I watched her face because I was close enough to see it clearly, and because something told me, that instinct that occasionally operates faster than conscious thought, that her face was going to be worth watching. She was looking at the Kalori cadets first. Her expression was the one she wore during cohort reviews when she was gathering information, calm, precise, attentive. She had clearly come around the corridor at some point during the exchange, because I could see in the set of her features that she was processing something she had already registered. Then her eyes moved to Elias. He was still walking, unhurried, hands behind his back. He hadn't seen her yet. And I watched something happen in Commander Yale Das's face that I have tried to describe to 6 different people since and have not managed to describe well. It was not surprise. It was not emotion in any obvious sense. It was something quieter and more precise. The expression of a person who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it in an unexpected place. She stopped walking. Elias reached her. He looked up, and I saw the exact moment he registered that this was Commander Das, because his posture shifted by a fraction and he moved to straighten, to offer a salute as protocol required. And she saluted first. Segment 10, the salute. I want to be very careful here, because I've been asked in 3 separate debriefs to describe exactly what happened, and I want to get it right. Commander Das brought her right hand up to her temple in the integration command salute, a clean, precise movement, the way someone salutes when they mean it and have meant it 10,000 times before. She held it there for a 3 count, which is longer than the standard 1 count salute used for routine acknowledgement. The 3 count is a deep salute, a recognition salute, the kind you offer to someone who has done something. Elias, who had been in the process of initiating his own salute, held it in return. He was clearly uncertain. I could see it in the slight hesitation in his hand, not fear, just the careful attention of someone trying to understand what was happening and respond correctly. Then Commander Das lowered her hand and said something to him. I was close enough to hear, barely. The ambient sound of the station's environmental systems, the steady low hum that you stop noticing after the first week, was loud enough that I caught only fragments. But I heard, knew before the first debrief, should have looked at your file earlier. And then, the first one in 3 intakes, come find me this afternoon. And Elias said something quiet in return. I couldn't hear it, and Commander Das nodded once firmly and continued past him down the corridor, toward the Kalori cadets, who had been watching all of this. I watched them watching it. Vethok's face is hard for humans to read. Kalori facial musculature is arranged differently, and the social expressions don't map cleanly. But I had been living in close proximity to 4 Kalori for 43 days, and I had learned to read the gross signals. The position of the secondary jaw, the degree of eye-ridge engagement, the angle of the posture. Vethok's secondary jaw was closed tight. His eye ridges were elevated. His posture had shifted in a way I had only seen Kalori do once before, when a senior instructor had corrected Scarin in front of the group, a specific compression of the torso, a pulling in, a recalibration. He was reassessing. Not just Elias, everything. Segment 11, Commander Das and the cadets. Commander Das stopped when she reached the 4 Kalori cadets. They drew themselves up immediately. Integration command protocol requires cadets to stand to attention when a commanding officer addresses them. And whatever else the Kalori cadets were in that moment, they were not going to violate protocol in front of a quad commander. She looked at each of them in turn. Not a long look, just enough to be thorough. The kind of assessment that misses nothing and signals to the person being assessed that it has missed nothing. She said in Galactic Standard, clearly enough that I heard every word. You were discussing stick-and-rock warfare. Silence. Vethok, credit to him in that moment, did not attempt evasion. He said formally, yes, Commander. Commander Das said, good, you should be. Another silence. She said, Cadet Bikel's ancestors developed the atlatl, the war club, the recurve bow, the siege ladder, the stake fortification, the phalanx, the flanking assault, the artillery battery, the combined arms unit, the radio-coordinated advance, the aerial support doctrine, the orbital strike calculation, and approximately 40,000 other innovations across 12,000 years of continuous warfare, all before they met a single species that hadn't. She paused. They did all of that, she said, in the same amount of time it took your civilization to figure out deep space navigation. Another pause, shorter. You would do well to think carefully, she said, about what that means for a species you've just met. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to land, short enough not to become a lecture, and then she continued down the corridor in the direction she had been going. I watched the Kalori cadets. I watched Vethok specifically. He turned slowly to look in the direction Elias had walked. The observation deck. The amber star. His expression was unreadable to me in that moment, but something in his posture had changed in a way that I couldn't name yet, but would come to understand over the weeks that followed. Segment 12, the observation deck. I went to the equipment bay and I had my pressure suit fitting, and it took 22 minutes, and for all 22 of those minutes I was only partly present. The technician, a preth named Long-Reaching Thought who went by Lon, had to ask me twice to hold still, which I normally don't need to be told. After the fitting, I had 40 minutes before morning formation. I should have gone back to my quarters and reviewed the tactical theory reading that I was already behind on. I went to the observation deck instead. Elias was there. He was standing at the wide curved viewport that looks out over the amber star, the one that fills half the wall in deep burnt orange and makes the room feel like perpetual late afternoon. He was standing close to the viewport, close enough that the light caught the planes of his face in a way that made him look carved from something. He didn't look up when I came in, but he said, "Menon." "Bikel," I said. There was a silence that was comfortable because Elias made silences comfortable simply by being at ease within them. I went and stood near him, not next to him. There was a kind of privacy in his stillness that I didn't want to violate, but close enough that we were both looking at the same star. After a moment I said, "You knew she was there." It wasn't a question. I'd been turning it over and I was fairly sure, though I hadn't been sure until I heard myself say it. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard the door." "And you kept walking." "Yes." I thought about that. You didn't react differently, knowing she was watching. "No." "Why not?" Elias turned his head slightly and looked at me. He had a way of looking at you that felt like being assessed, not harshly, but precisely, like he was finding the accurate thing to say and nothing more. He said, because the response was the same either way, it didn't matter who was watching, it mattered what the right thing to do was. He turned back to the star. "The right thing was to not give it anything," he said. "So I didn't." I stood there for a while longer and watched the amber star and thought about 12,000 years of warfare, and about a woman who had held a salute for 3 full counts in a corridor at 6 in the morning, and about the specific, uncommon quality of a person who already knows who they are and doesn't need anyone to confirm it. Then I went to morning formation. Segment 13, afternoon, the commander's office. This part I didn't witness. I'm including it because Elias told me about it later, about a month later, during a night rotation in the simulation bay when we had a 2-hour gap between exercises. He told me in the same way he told most things, without preamble, without dramatization, just the straight line of it. He went to Commander Das's office at 1400 hours, as she'd instructed. The office is on the command level, which cadets rarely visit. It's a large space by station standards. The commander has held that rank for 11 years and has accumulated the territorial privilege that comes with longevity. The walls have charts, not digital displays, actual printed charts, the kind that have to be updated by hand. Elias noticed them because he was the kind of person who noticed the things that told you something real about who a person was. Commander Das was at her desk when he arrived. She looked up when he knocked and waved him in, and she pointed at the chair across from her desk and she said, "Sit." He sat. She looked at him for a moment, the same assessment look he'd seen in the corridor, he said, but more direct, and then she said, "3 commanding officers recommended you. That's rare." "Yes, Commander." I read the recommendations last night after I saw your name in the dormitory assignment logs, she said. I should have read them before intake. That's on me. Elias said nothing, which was, Commander Das apparently told him, the correct response. She said, "What do you know about the Combined Species Accord Leadership Track?" Elias knew what it was, a special accelerated pathway for cadets who demonstrated particular qualities. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't in the intake literature. It was extended by invitation from the cohort commander, and it had been extended to 3 cadets in the Academy's 11-year history. He said, "I know it exists." "It's not an honor track," she said. "It's a harder track. More hours, more responsibility, more exposure to command decisions you're not ready for. The graduation rate is 50%. "I understand, Commander." She looked at him again. Then she said something that Elias told me he turned over in his mind for a long time afterward, because it was the most direct thing a commanding officer had ever said to him. "I've been at this academy for 11 years. I've watched a lot of cadets sort themselves out, figure out who they are, what they're made of. Most of them need the whole 2 years. Some of them need longer and don't get it. Occasionally, and I mean very occasionally, one comes through who already knows, who sorted themselves out a long time ago in some other corridor, some other context, and they're just here now to formalize it." She picked up her stylus. "You're not here to learn who you are, Bikel," she said. "You already know. What I can offer you is the context to use it." She extended the invitation. He accepted. Segment 14, the following days. The Academy, because it is a military training institution, does not slow down to allow for reflection. By breakfast the morning after Hall 7, we were back in tactical theory, and then physical training, and then the afternoon simulator block, and the incident, if you could call a 9-second silence and a 3-count salute an incident, was just something that had happened in a corridor while most of us were barely awake. Except that it wasn't. I watched the change happen in the weeks that followed. Not a dramatic change. The Academy is not a place where dramatic changes happen visibly. There's too much structure, too much routine, too much forward momentum for anything to stop and reorient. But changes happen within the structure, in the quiet spaces, in the way people look at each other in the cafeteria and in the hallway, and during the brief resting periods in physical training. The Kalori cadets changed. Not immediately, not all at once, but they changed. Vethok was the most interesting to watch because Vethok was the most complicated. He was not stupid. None of the Kalori cadets were stupid. The Academy's admission standards are brutally high, and he was not, I came to believe, a cruel person. He was a young soldier from a hierarchy culture who had applied his cultural framework to a situation where it didn't fit, and the framework had failed him, and he was processing that failure. I watched him start to watch Elias differently. Not with the dismissiveness of the first 6 weeks, with attention, the specific attention of someone who is trying to understand something they previously misread. He started sitting near Elias in the cafeteria. Not with him, not immediately, but at the adjacent table, angled so that he could observe without making it conspicuous, which, for a Kalori, is a significant behavioral modification. Their culture generally considers covert observation beneath dignity. If you want to know something about someone, you ask. The fact that Vethok was being covert about it suggested he wasn't yet ready to ask. On day 58, 15 days after Hall 7, there was a joint exercise in the tactical simulator. Intake Group 7 against Group 4, a simulated perimeter defense scenario. Elias was assigned command of our defensive unit, which was also somewhat unusual. Command assignment in exercises rotates, but it had been rotated to him early in the cycle, a choice that, in retrospect, had Commander Das's fingerprints on it. The exercise lasted 90 minutes. Elias held the perimeter with 4 cadets against a 7-cadet assault with less than optimal equipment, which was the design. The scenario was rigged against us, the point being to observe how the defending unit handled a losing position. He didn't hold the perimeter by fighting harder. He held it by making Group 4 fight the terrain instead of us. A series of repositioning moves that changed the geometry of the assault and cost Group 4 3 of their 7 cadets in failed maneuvers before the scenario ended. The simulation instructors gave Group 7 a technical victory, which was extremely rare in a rigged losing position scenario. Afterward, in the debrief room, Vethok sat across from Elias, and he looked at him, not with the flat, dismissive look of 6 weeks ago, but with the particular direct attention of a Kalori who is about to breach the convention of covert observation and ask the question openly. He said, in Galactic Standard, formally, "How did you know where they would commit their third wave?" Elias looked at him, the same still look. Then he said, "I watched where your lead cadet looked when he thought we weren't paying attention. People show you where they're going before they know they've decided." Vethok was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And this part I remember because I was sitting 3 seats away and the room was quiet," and Vethok said it with a precision and deliberateness that made it clearly not casual. "I made an error of assessment earlier." Elias said, "I know." Vethok said, "My framework was wrong." Elias said, "Your framework was yours, it just didn't apply here." Another silence. Vethok said, "I would like to understand why." And Elias, and this is the moment I think I understood something essential about him, said, "Stick around then." Not coldly, not with any edge, just simply. As though the question had an answer, and the answer was available if Vethok was willing to be present for it. Vethok stuck around. Segment 15, Building Tension, the deeper story. Let me tell you what I learned, over the weeks that followed, about why Commander Das had stopped in that corridor. She told the story herself, eventually. Not to us, to a group of senior instructors at a command review session that one of the junior instructors later shared with me under the condition that I not attribute it directly. So I'm going to paraphrase what I heard without sourcing, because that's the most accurate thing I can do. She said she had come around the corner of the outer corridor and heard the Kalori cadets speaking. She hadn't been able to hear specific content. The Kalori were speaking in their own language, but she had heard the register. She had 11 years of experience with Kalori cadets, and she recognized the register. She had stopped out of line of sight, and she had waited. Not to intervene. She was clear about this. Her first instinct had not been to intervene, because intervention in that kind of moment, a group of cadets sorting out their social hierarchy, is often counterproductive. What she had wanted to see was what the human cadet did. She said she had seen, in 11 years, all the ways cadets respond to that kind of pressure from higher-standing cohort members. She had seen anger, which is understandable and mostly counterproductive. She had seen submission, which is human enough and also mostly counterproductive. She had seen avoidance cadets who changed their routes, their schedules, their habits to minimize contact. She had seen escalation, cadets who met aggression with aggression. She had seen desperate performance, cadets who worked twice as hard in visible ways to prove their standing. She had never, she said, seen what Elias did. She had never seen a cadet simply, and she paused here apparently and chose the word carefully, be. Just be who he was, not performing it, not defending it, not demanding recognition of it, just inhabiting it so completely and so quietly that the alternative mockery, dismissal, the performance of subordination, became structurally impossible to sustain. She said that the thing Elias had done was harder than any of the other options, that it required a kind of internal stability that took most people years to develop, and some people never developed at all. That in a soldier, in a leader specifically, it was one of the rarest qualities she had encountered. And then she said, He stood in that corridor the way I stood in a transit valley on the fourth day of the Kalori conflict, with 12 soldiers watching me and an assault coming in 40 minutes, and I didn't know what to do and I couldn't show that I didn't know what to do. I stood there and I was just present, just fully, absolutely present, and somehow that was enough. She said, I recognized it because it was something I'd had to learn. He was born with it, or he'd learned it so young it had become structural. And that is not something I can give someone. That is either there or it isn't. That's why she saluted. Not to honor him, not to shame the Kalori cadets, though she acknowledged that was an effect, not to make a point. Because she recognized something rare when she saw it. And she was old enough and experienced enough and honest enough to acknowledge it regardless of what the protocols said about saluting cadets. She said, I'll break that rule again if I see it again, and I'll do it without apology. Segment 16, tension rising. What the salute spread. Word spread through the academy with the velocity that information always spreads in enclosed communities. Fast, incompletely, with escalating details. By the end of day 43, every cadet in the Western dormitory block had heard some version of what had happened in Hall 7. By the end of day 44, it had reached the command-level instructors and the Eastern dormitory block. By the end of day 47, cadets in the senior intake 2 years ahead of us knew about it, and 2 of them had found reasons to walk past Elias in the cafeteria in a way that was clearly deliberate. The details that spread were not always accurate. I heard 3 different versions by the end of the first week. In one version, Commander Das had dressed down the Kalori cadets in the corridor in front of everyone. In another version, Elias had said something devastating to Vethok that reduced him to silence. In a third, the salute had been for something else entirely, some record or achievement that nobody could specify. None of these were what happened. What happened was simpler and I think more significant. A very quiet, very competent man walked through a corridor in the right way. An old soldier recognized it. A salute happened. But what the stories, the slightly exaggerated, detail-imprecise stories, did was change the social geometry of the academy in ways that were slow and real. The Kalori cadets and other intake groups started paying different attention to the human cadets. Not dramatically, not uniformly, but in the simulation exercises, in the tactical theory seminars, in the physical training blocks, there was a perceptible shift in the quality of attention. Where before there had been the slightly dismissive air of a species that was used to being considered the best soldiers in the coalition, the Kalori had the most developed military tradition of any species in the Accord, and they knew it. And they wore that knowledge the way some people wear expensive clothing. There was now something more like active curiosity. They were watching, the way Vethok had started watching. One of the senior Kalori cadets, a third year named Rashvor, who was considered something close to a prodigy by the Academy's standards, requested a meeting with the human intake coordinator to ask for additional context on human military history. The intake coordinator, a quiet man named Sergeant Abumseli who had been with the academy for 7 years, told me later that the request had surprised him. He said, Rashvor came in with a list of specific conflicts he wanted to understand, not the big ones, the famous ones, the ones in the coalition briefing files, the small ones, the ones that didn't make the files. He asked me why we fought so many of them. What did you tell him? I asked. Sergeant Abumseli said, I told him I wasn't sure that was the right question. He thought about it for a while and then said, then what's the right question? And I said, maybe it's not why you fought them. Maybe it's how you kept getting up after each one. He paused. Rashvor said he would think about that, Abumseli said. He came back 3 days later and said he'd thought about it and he wanted to read everything we had on human endurance psychology. Did you give it to him? I gave him the reading list. It was very long. Segment 17, Climax, the exercise. The climax, if Hall 7 was the beginning, and the corridors and cafeterias and quiet shifts in attention were the middle, came on day 89, in the Academy's inter-cohort joint exercise. The joint exercise is the largest event in the first intake cycle. Every intake group from the first-year cohort, 7 groups, 94 cadets, is put into a single extended simulation. The scenario varies year to year. This year it was a multi-vector defensive operation with a simultaneous extraction component. Protect a command installation on a simulated planet surface while extracting a disabled deep-range communication unit from a contested zone 2 kilometers away. Both objectives had to be completed. Failing either meant failing the exercise. It required simultaneous operation of 2 separate tactical units with coordinated command. The simulation instructors assigned unit commanders by pulling names from a randomized selector, ostensibly random, though every cadet understood that the system was calibrated to produce instructive selections. The first unit commander drawn was Rashfor, the third-year Kalori prodigy. The second was Elias. Rashfor commanded the installation defense. Elias commanded the extraction unit. The exercise ran for 4 hours. I was in Elias' extraction unit, which had 11 cadets, 4 humans, 3 Kalori including Vethok, 2 Vranathi, and 1 Gajik named Orvrak who was the size of a small vehicle and could lift structural components with 1 limb. It was a genuinely mixed unit in every sense, and the simulation was designed to be brutally difficult. The contested zone was designed to require tactical improvisation, not by-the-book application, because by-the-book had been deliberately anticipated and countered in the scenario construction. I won't reconstruct the entire 4 hours. That account already exists in the simulation logs and the official debrief record. What I want to tell you about is a specific moment in the 3rd hour, because it's the moment that made the exercise what it was. We were pinned, simulation pinned, which means the system had assessed our position as effectively trapped and was generating the equivalent of sustained heavy fire from 2 directions simultaneously. The objective was approximately 400 meters ahead. The extraction unit had taken 3 simulated casualties, which meant 3 cadets were sitting out with disqualifying markers on their suits, and the remaining 8 of us were behind a simulated terrain feature that the system's geometry said was not sustainable cover. Elias had been quiet for about 40 seconds. In 4 hours of continuous exercise, I had learned to track his silences. Short silences, 3 to 5 seconds, meant he was applying a solution he'd already formulated and was sequencing the implementation. Medium silences, 10 to 20 seconds, meant he was reformulating because his first assessment had turned out to be wrong about something. Long silences, the kind where you started to wonder if something had gone wrong, were rare. 40 seconds was the longest I'd observed. Vethok, who was crouched to my left and had, over the previous 2 months, developed the particular quality of attention around Elias that you develop around someone you've stopped underestimating, looked at me. Not with anxiety, with focus, as though my face might tell him something useful. I shrugged, which is very human. He didn't respond to it visibly, but he turned back to watching Elias. Elias said, without looking up from the terrain map he'd drawn on his knee with a marker, "Orvrak." Orvrak said, "Cadet Bikel. You can carry a Vranathi on each shoulder." Orvrak considered this with the massive, deliberate calm that Gajik bring to physical questions. At a run, 40 seconds. Sustained, longer. Not running, walking, but walking without hesitation, on uneven terrain. Yes. Good. Elias looked up. The system knows where we are. It doesn't know where we're going to be in 7 seconds because we haven't been there before. The only move that isn't anticipated is the one that doesn't exist in its database. He explained the approach. It took 3 minutes. At the end of those 3 minutes, 8 of us looked at each other with the expression that people share when they've just heard an idea that is simultaneously very simple and very strange and might actually work. We did it. The approach required Orvrak to carry both Vrenathi cadets as mobile elevation platforms, while the rest of us ran in a vector that the simulation's fire pattern hadn't calculated for, because it required moving through a zone that its own logic had assessed as a fire source rather than a corridor, meaning it didn't have coverage there, because it thought nothing would try to move through it. We lost 2 more simulated casualties. We extracted the communication unit. Rashvor's unit held the installation, 2 minutes before the exercise clock ran out. Full completion. The simulation room was very quiet when the completion signal sounded. Then Orvrak sat down on the floor, which with a Gajik makes a sound like a controlled implosion, and said in the flat, even tone that Gajik used for everything, "That was interesting." And the room began to be less quiet. Segment 18, Resolution. The debrief took 3 hours. Commander Das ran it herself, which was unusual. The simulation debriefs are typically conducted by the exercise instructors. She sat at the head of the debrief table, and she listened to each unit's account, Rashvor first, then Elia's, then each cadet in sequence, and she asked questions that were surgical in their precision. The kind of questions that don't ask you to defend your decisions, but to understand them, which is harder. At the end, she went through the assessment. The exercise had been designed, she said, to fail. Not impossible, obviously, since we'd completed it, but calibrated to fail. Every simulation the Academy ran at this level was calibrated to fail, because the point was not success. The point was what cadets did with a position that appeared to have no solution. She said that 3 things had happened in this exercise that she wanted the full cohort to understand, regardless of which unit they'd been in. First, Rashvor had made a decision in the second hour to sacrifice a section of the installation's eastern perimeter in order to consolidate a stronger defensive position at the core. It was not in the protocol. It was correct. Second, Elias had made a decision in the third hour to use the simulation's own logic against itself, which she described as the kind of solution that only becomes available to someone who understands the system well enough to see where it doesn't understand itself. Third, and here she paused, and her voice shifted in a way that made the room become very still. Third, in both cases, the critical element had not been the decision itself. It had been the quality of stillness that preceded it. She said, "In both instances, I want you to understand what you were watching. When Rashvor held the eastern perimeter's assessment for 90 seconds before redirecting, those were the 90 seconds in which most people would have filled the silence with a bad decision. When Cadet Bikel sat with a pin position for 40 seconds before finding the approach, those were 40 seconds in which the system simulation of sustained fire was trying to generate a panic response in the unit, and the unit's response was to wait for its commander, and its commander's response was to not be hurried." She looked around the table. "That is what I want you to understand about leadership," she said, "not the decision. The quality of presence that makes the right decision possible." She looked at Elias when she said it, briefly, not long enough to make it into a thing, but long enough to be unmistakable. Vethok, who was sitting across the table from Elias, looked at Elias at the same time. And Elias was looking at the table, making a note on his paper with his pen, and if he was aware of being looked at, he gave no indication of it. Segment 19 afterward, the corridor again. I went back to Hall 7 3 days after the exercise. Not for any particular reason. My route to the equipment maintenance bay takes me through it, and I go to the equipment maintenance bay every 3rd day to log my pressure suit's calibration. It's a protocol requirement, and it just happens that my route goes through Hall 7. But I stopped, this time in the spot where Elias had stopped. the spot where he'd stepped to the side and waited for the Kalori cadets to pass. I stood there for a moment. The corridor was empty. The lighting was at full daytime, bright, functional, the amber star blocked out by the station's shutters on this side during peak hours. I thought about what it would have been like to stand here and be looked at by 4 cadets who had already decided you weren't worth looking at, and to say the right thing, and to walk away, and to not need anything from it. I thought about 12,000 years. About atlatls and recurve bows and radio-coordinated advances. About all the ways humans had learned to fight, and more importantly, all the ways they had learned to keep going after the fights were done. About the specific, accumulated, inherited knowledge of a species that had been at war with itself for longer than most spacefaring civilizations had been spacefaring, and had somehow, made it to the other side of that with something intact. Not unscarred, not simple, not easy, but intact. I thought about Elias standing in this corridor and saying, to the specific question of whether human weapons were primitive, that those weapons had won every war that needed winning. Not a boast, just a fact. The quietest, most precise fact available. And I thought that this was the thing about humans that we were only beginning as a species to understand about ourselves, that our greatest weapon had never been the technology, had never been the ingenuity, though we had that, had never been the stubbornness, though we had that in abundance. It had been the stillness, the specific, hard-earned, often battered stillness of a species that had survived everything it had put itself through and had learned, had been forced to learn. That panic is a luxury, and that the right answer usually lives in the 40 seconds of quiet before the decision. Elias had been born with it, or learned it very young, or learned it in mountains I'm not authorized to name. It didn't matter which. It was there. It was real. And Commander Das had seen it in a corridor at 6:18 in the morning and had offered it the recognition it deserved. I stood in Hall 7 for another minute. Then I continued to the equipment maintenance bay and logged my calibration and went about my day. Segment 20, Final Testimony, VTHOK. I'm including this section because Commander Das's instruction was to include every witness account, and Vethok submitted one, and she asked me to incorporate relevant portions with his permission. He gave it. Vethok's account was originally in Kalori and was translated by the Academy's language service. The translation has been approved by Vethok as accurate. He wrote, "In Kalori culture, we are taught from early age that standing is shown, not assumed, that you cannot claim a position, you can only demonstrate it through visible assertion. This is the framework through which I assessed my cohort in the early weeks of intake. I assessed Cadet Bikel as low standing because he did not assert. This was the first error. I had failed to consider that a different cultural tradition might express high standing through different means. I made a second error in the corridor. I treated a testing situation as a social one. In a social situation, assertion confirms standing. In a testing situation, assertion only reveals how much you need the confirmation. Cadet Bikel passed a test I did not know was being administered. I failed it. What I have learned in the months since, through observation, through the exercise record, through the frankness of the commander's assessment, is that human military culture carries within it a particular paradox. The highest standing individuals are often the quietest, and the quietest individuals are often the most dangerous. Not dangerous in the aggressive sense, dangerous in the sense of being more capable than anticipated. I have begun, with Cadet Bikel's tolerance, to study this. He does not explain himself often, but when he does, he explains clearly. He told me once that the capacity to be underestimated is a tactical advantage, and that the only people who successfully leverage it are those who are genuinely unbothered by being underestimated. I asked him if he was ever bothered. He said not by that. I did not ask what he was bothered by, because I think that is a longer conversation, and we are still at the beginning of a long acquaintance. I am told this account is for the historical archive. If it is for the historical archive, then I want to record clearly. The error in Hall 7 was mine. The assessment I made was wrong. I have adjusted my framework, and the cadet I dismissed as low standing is the reason I performed better in every exercise after day 43. I am grateful for the correction, even though I did not ask for it. That, too, may be something I needed to learn. Closing record. Filed by Cadet 3rd Class Priya Menon, Intake Group 7, 1st Unification Cohort, Year 3. Co-signatories: Cadet Vethok of the 3rd Kalori House, Sergeant 1st Class Abumseli, Human Intake Coordinator, Commander Yale Das, Quad Commander, Veloran Military Integration Academy. Commander Das added a note to the file before it was archived. She wrote it by hand, in her own handwriting, and the archivist scanned it into the record rather than transcribing it, because she asked for it to be preserved in her handwriting. It says, "In 31 years of service, I have saluted 2 cadets. The first was in a combat simulation on year 1 of the Joint Accord trials, when a 17-year-old Kalori named Ashvorak held a position alone for 22 minutes that should have required 6 soldiers. He went on to become the coalition's youngest commanding officer. The second was in a corridor on an amber-lit station, when a 26-year-old human was told that his ancestors had fought with sticks and rocks, and responded, without anger, without pride, without any of the noise that most people need, with the simple truth that those sticks and rocks had won. I saluted because the moment deserved it. I will spend no further words justifying it. What I will say is this. In all the years I have spent trying to build something from the ruins of 7 civilizations that spent centuries trying to destroy each other, the single most useful thing I have found is not strategy, not technology, not protocol. It is the occasional discovery of a person who already knows who they are. We don't make those people here, we find them. And when we find them, we are wise enough to pay attention. This record exists so that we do not forget what paying attention looks like.